None of them paid attention to the way the wind had begun to change outside, shifting from the south to carry something different in its breath. Weather patterns meant little to men who had just arrived, who assumed Texas meant heat and dust, cowboys and empty spaces baked under relentless sun. Their knowledge of American geography came from propaganda films and half-remembered lessons, images that bore little relation to reality. They did not know that cold could descend from northern plains with the speed of armies, that temperatures could plummet in hours, that this particular region sat exposed to meteorological forces that recognized no boundaries. The guards who distributed the blankets said nothing about what was coming. They had received their orders, completed their tasks, moved through routines polished by repetition. Whether the prisoners mocked or accepted the supplies made no difference to men who had processed hundreds of such arrivals, who would process hundreds more before the war concluded. They noted the laughter with the mild interest of observers watching a play whose ending they already knew, then retreated to their own quarters where coffee waited and shifts changed with mechanical regularity. As darkness claimed the camp, settling over barracks and wire like a physical presence, the temperature began its descent. At first, the change seemed negligible, merely the natural cooling that follows sunset. Men settled onto their bunks, some still trading jokes about the inadequate bedding, others falling silent with the fatigue of long travel and uncertainty. The barracks held heat from the day, wood releasing stored warmth in gradual increments, creating a temporary illusion of comfort. This would not last. Major Dieter Kraus had served as quartermaster for a regiment stationed near Munich, responsible for supplies and logistics, the unglamorous work that kept armies functional. He prided himself on understanding materials, on knowing the difference between adequate and superior, between economy and waste. Now he lay on his assigned bunk, staring at the ceiling boards, and held forth to anyone who would listen about the standards he had maintained. German blankets, he explained, were manufactured to precise specifications, wool sourced from specific regions, woven by craftsmen who had learned their trade through generations. A single blanket weighed nearly 5 kilograms when new, its density calculated to provide insulation under the harshest conditions. Stack 3 or 4 together, and you created a barrier capable of withstanding alpine cold, the kind of cold that killed the unprepared without mercy. His voice carried the authority of expertise, and others listened because listening meant they did not have to confront their own growing unease. The major spoke of warehouses stocked with proper supplies, of distribution systems that ensured every soldier received equipment worthy of his service. He described the feel of real wool, its slight roughness against skin, the way it absorbed moisture without losing its insulating properties, the particular smell it carried when new and the different smell it acquired after months of use. These details mattered, he insisted, because they represented civilization, the accumulated knowledge of a culture that understood survival. Lieutenant Weiss added his own memories, speaking of barracks where soldiers could wrap themselves multiple times in their issued bedding and still feel winter penetrating through walls and floors. If such thick covers could not completely eliminate cold, he reasoned, what hope did these American rags offer? The logic seemed unassailable, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the darkened barracks. Men adjusted their thin blankets with resignation, expecting discomfort, already composing complaints they would voice come morning. Outside, invisible to those within, the cold front advanced. Meteorologists tracking its progress could have predicted the severity, could have warned of conditions unusual for the season and dangerous to the unprepared. But weather predictions did not reach German prisoners in Texas camps, and even if they had, the warnings would have meant little to men who considered themselves veterans of worse. They had endured Russian winters, or so they told themselves, had marched through snow that reached their knees, had slept in foxholes where frost formed on their eyelashes. Texas could not possibly compare. The wind arrived first, announcing the cold's approach with a rising howl that made the barracks creak and groan. Drafts found every imperfection in the construction, every gap between boards, every poorly fitted window frame. The temperature outside dropped past freezing, then continued falling, driven by air masses that had gathered momentum across 1,000 miles of open terrain. Inside, men began to stir, shifting positions, pulling their inadequate covers tighter, reaching for jackets to layer over themselves. Sergeant Otto Rice had fought on the Eastern Front, had experienced cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, had seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite, had learned to respect winter as an enemy more implacable than any human adversary. He lay in his bunk now, feeling the temperature drop with each passing hour, and began to worry in a way he had not worried since leaving the combat zone. This was different from battlefield cold, where at least you could move, could march, could generate heat through activity. Here they were confined, stationary, dependent entirely on whatever protection their bedding could provide. He pulled the American blanket up to his chin, tucking edges around his body with the automatic precision of someone who had done this countless times. The fabric felt insubstantial, almost weightless, nothing like the heavy wool he remembered. Yet as he lay still, letting his body heat collect in the space between himself and the covering, he noticed something unexpected. The cold was not penetrating as quickly as he had anticipated. The blanket seemed to be trapping warmth, holding it close to his skin despite its apparent flimsiness. He pressed his palm against the fabric and felt heat radiating back, his own warmth reflected and contained. Rice said nothing to his companions, uncertain whether his observation meant anything or whether he was merely fooling himself, finding comfort where none existed. Around him, other men made their own discoveries, silent realizations that perhaps their mockery had been premature. The barracks filled with sounds of movement, bodies adjusting, blankets being repositioned, quiet curses directed at the cold and at circumstances that had brought them to this place. By midnight, the temperature outside had fallen to levels that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. Frost formed on every exposed surface, turning the camp into a crystalline landscape that glittered under guard lights. Inside the barracks, breath became visible, white plumes rising toward the ceiling where they dispersed and vanished. Men who had been sleeping fitfully woke fully, shocked by the intensity of the cold, no longer able to dismiss it as merely uncomfortable. This had become dangerous, the kind of cold that killed if allowed to penetrate, that shut down bodies and stopped hearts. Lieutenant Weiss found himself curled into a tight ball, knees drawn to his chest, the despised American blanket wrapped around him like a cocoon. He had tucked every edge, eliminating gaps, creating a sealed environment where his body heat could accumulate. Despite the thin material, despite his earlier certainty of its inadequacy, he was warm. Not comfortable, not luxurious in the way he remembered from better times, but warm enough to survive, warm enough to function. The realization struck him with the force of revelation, and with it came a sharp twist of something that might have been shame. Across the barracks, a young private named Hans Keller began to shiver violently, his body convulsing with tremors he could not control. At 20, he was among the youngest in the group, drafted barely past childhood, rushed through training and thrown into combat before he had time to understand what war meant. Now he lay in darkness, terrified that he was freezing to death, that his body was shutting down, that he would die here in this foreign place surrounded by strangers. His gasping breaths drew attention, and two older prisoners moved to his bunk without discussion, bringing their own blankets, pressing their bodies against his for additional warmth, creating a huddle of shared heat. The three men lay together, barriers of rank and background dissolved by necessity, their combined blankets forming a makeshift shield against the killing cold. Slowly, incrementally, Keller's shivering subsided. His breathing steadied. Colour returned to his face. The crisis passed, and in its wake came understanding. These blankets, mocked and derided, scorned as evidence of American incompetence, had just saved a life. Perhaps multiple lives. The joke had transformed into something else entirely, and no one was laughing now. Hours dragged past with glacial slowness, each minute measured by the effort required to maintain warmth, to keep blood flowing, to prevent the cold from claiming victory. Men who had fought battles, who had faced death in various forms, now engaged in a different kind of struggle, one without drama or glory, simply the grinding work of survival through a night that seemed determined to kill them. They clung to their thin American blankets with desperate gratitude, no longer caring about pride or superiority, focused entirely on seeing dawn. When first light finally appeared, seeping through cracks and windows with painful slowness, it revealed a barracks transformed. Frost coated the interior walls, decorating rough wood with delicate patterns of ice. The air itself seemed frozen, heavy and still. Men stirred slowly, muscles stiff from hours of tension, faces pale and drawn from exhaustion and cold. But they stirred. They moved. They had survived. One by one, prisoners sat up, unwrapping themselves from their blankets with reluctance, knowing that exposing themselves to the air meant renewed discomfort. They looked at the fabric in their hands with new eyes, seeing not cheap substitutes but engineering, not weakness but innovation. The transformation in perception was complete, though few would have admitted it aloud. Pride dies hard, and German pride, cultivated through years of propaganda and military tradition, fought against acknowledgement even as evidence mounted. Outside, the sun climbed into a sky of painful clarity, cold and bright, offering light without warmth. Guards emerged from their quarters, bundled in heavy coats, their breath visible in great clouds. They moved through routines with the stiffness of men who had also spent an uncomfortable night, though their accommodations had been marginally better than those of the prisoners. No one spoke of the cold front, of its unusual severity, of the fact that such weather was rare for the season and location. It had happened, that was all, and now they would deal with whatever consequences it had brought. The morning count proceeded as always, prisoners filing out to stand in formation, while guards verified numbers and checked faces against lists. Men shuffled in place, trying to generate warmth through movement, huddling together when they thought no one was watching. Their German discipline, so often praised and relied upon, had not prepared them for this particular humiliation, the discovery that their assumptions about American weakness had been catastrophically wrong. Breakfast came in the form of hot coffee and bland porridge, served in quantities that still seemed excessive to men accustomed to wartime rations. They crowded around the serving stations, hands wrapped around warm cups, savouring heat that penetrated through metal and ceramic into frozen fingers. Conversation remained subdued, scattered exchanges rather than the usual morning chatter. Everyone was thinking about the night just past, processing what it meant, what it revealed. Captain Walter Mills made his rounds through the camp, an American officer whose responsibility included ensuring prisoners received proper treatment according to international agreements. He had witnessed many such arrivals, had processed countless groups of captured enemy soldiers, had developed a practiced indifference to their complaints and observations. This morning, however, he noted something different in the demeanour of the new arrivals, a subdued quality that went beyond mere exhaustion. When a guard mentioned the severe cold front, Mills nodded with understanding. He had seen this before, the moment when prisoners confronted the gap between their expectations and American reality. Mills knew about the blankets because he had overseen their distribution countless times. They were manufactured, he could have explained, from synthetic materials developed specifically for military use, combinations of rayon and other fibres engineered in laboratories and refined through industrial processes. Unlike wool, which required raising sheep and processing their fleece through time-consuming methods, these materials could be produced at scale, manufactured in factories that operated around the clock, shipped in quantities that would have seemed impossible to European logistics officers. A single facility in Massachusetts, Mills had learned during a briefing, produced more than 250,000 blankets every month. Other factories contributed similar amounts, feeding a supply chain that distributed materials across a continent and beyond, to bases and camps and ships, to soldiers fighting in every theatre of war, and yes, even to prisoners who needed to be kept alive and functional. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible to minds trained in scarcity, in rationing, in making do with whatever limited resources could be scraped together. One of the guards, a talkative corporal who had grown bored with routine, mentioned these production figures to another guard within earshot of several prisoners. The numbers travelled through the camp with the speed of rumour, repeated and questioned and verified as much as possible. 250,000 blankets monthly from a single factory. It seemed like propaganda, exaggeration designed to demoralise, yet the evidence lay in their hands. They had the blankets. They had survived the night because of them. The mathematics, impossible as it seemed, had to contain some truth. Major Krauss found himself wrestling with cognitive dissonance, trying to reconcile what he believed about German industrial superiority with what he had experienced. Germany manufactured blankets, certainly, but in quantities measured by thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Production had been disrupted by bombing, by material shortages, by the diversion of resources to weapons and munitions. Civilian populations made do with whatever they could salvage, cutting up old coats, repurposing curtains, learning to live with cold because there was no alternative. And yet here, in enemy territory, prisoners received new blankets as a matter of routine, items considered so commonplace they generated no comment from the Americans distributing them. The cognitive shift required was enormous, demanding a fundamental reassessment of assumptions that had seemed unquestionable. If America could produce blankets at such scale, what did that suggest about its capacity for manufacturing weapons, vehicles, ammunition? If even prisoners received equipment of surprising quality, what must American soldiers themselves possess? The questions multiplied, each one undermining foundations of belief that had sustained these men through years of war. Sergeant Rice sought out Lieutenant Weiss during a break in the morning routine, finding him alone at the edge of the parade ground, staring at nothing in particular. Rice spoke quietly, aware that others might overhear. He mentioned his own experience during the night, the unexpected effectiveness of the thin blanket, the grudging realization that engineering might matter more than tradition. Weiss listened in silence, then nodded slowly. He too had felt it, he admitted, the moment when mockery transformed into gratitude, when pride bent under the weight of survival. They discussed it carefully, testing ideas against each other, trying to understand what it meant. Neither wanted to betray their country, to abandon loyalty, to accept defeat as inevitable. Yet honesty demanded acknowledgement. The blanket had worked. It had worked better than their German equivalents would have in similar circumstances, because weight and thickness meant nothing if the weave could not trap heat efficiently. American engineers had solved a different problem, prioritizing portability and mass production over traditional metrics, and in doing so had created something genuinely superior. The day passed in routine activities, prisoners adjusting to their new circumstances, learning the rhythms of camp life. Guards explained rules, demonstrated procedures, answered questions with varying degrees of patience. The Americans seemed neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply professional, executing their duties with the detached efficiency of bureaucrats managing paperwork. This too surprised the prisoners, who had expected either brutality or condescension, not this bland competence that treated them as problems requiring orderly solutions. By afternoon, the sun had warmed the air enough to melt frost from exposed surfaces, though temperatures remained well below normal for the season. Men ventured outside when permitted, grateful for movement after confinement, stretching muscles and breathing deeply. The camp revealed itself in daylight as larger than it had seemed the previous evening, a collection of buildings and infrastructure designed to house hundreds, possibly thousands. Wire fences stretched in geometric patterns. Guard towers stood at calculated intervals, everything organized according to principles of security and control. Some prisoners noticed details that spoke of abundance, almost offensive in its casualness. Supply sheds stood open, revealing stacks of equipment and materials waiting for distribution. A warehouse visible in the distance appeared to be full. its doors propped ajar to show interior space packed with crates and boxes. Even the guards carried equipment that looked new, uniforms fresh, boots unscuffed, weapons clean and maintained. Nothing showed signs of shortage or improvisation, the telltale markers of an economy stretched beyond its limits. Conversation that afternoon turned philosophical, men debating what they had learned and what it meant. A corporal who had studied engineering before the war tried to explain synthetic fibers, describing chemical processes and molecular structures with the enthusiasm of someone glad to discuss his field. Others listened with mixed interest, understanding enough to grasp that science and industry had combined to produce materials their grandparents could never have imagined. This was modernity, progress, the future arriving whether they were ready or not. As evening approached and temperatures began dropping again, anticipation mixed with dread. Another night of cold awaited, though this time without the element of surprise. Men prepared methodically, arranging their bunks, organizing their meager possessions, ensuring their blankets were positioned for maximum effectiveness. The laughter of the previous night had vanished completely, replaced by serious preparation and quiet conversations about technique, about how best to trap heat and minimize drafts. When darkness fell and the barracks filled with settling sounds, with the creaks and rustles of men finding positions for sleep, the atmosphere held a different quality. No mockery now, no derision, only the focused awareness of people engaged in serious work. Outside, the wind began its nightly assault, whistling through gaps and pressing against walls, carrying cold that penetrated and searched for vulnerability. Inside, prisoners wrapped themselves in American blankets and faced the night with knowledge earned through experience. Lieutenant Weiss lay awake longer than most, listening to the sounds around him, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. Africa seemed like another lifetime. Battles fought under impossible sun, advances and retreats across landscapes that killed the careless, the gradual realization that victory was slipping away no matter how fiercely they fought. Capture had come almost as relief, an end to the grinding uncertainty, though he had not admitted this even to himself at the time. Now, lying in darkness in Texas, wrapped in a blanket he had once scorned, he confronted truths he had avoided. The war was lost. Perhaps it had been lost before it began, though he could not have known that then. Germany had challenged forces too vast to defeat, had gambled on quick victories and failed to achieve them, had found itself ground down by opponents whose resources seemed infinite. America, which he had been taught to dismiss as soft and decadent, had proven capable of mobilizing industry on scales that defied comprehension. This blanket, light and thin and scorned, represented that capacity, a tiny fragment of a productive power that had buried German efforts under sheer magnitude. Sleep came eventually, fitful and interrupted, but it came. Morning arrived with its cold brightness, and once again the prisoners stirred, once again they had survived. The pattern would repeat day after day, night after night, until eventually the cold front passed and temperatures returned to seasonal norms. But the memory of those first nights would remain, carved into consciousness with the clarity of lessons learned through direct experience. The second full day brought new developments. Guards announced that additional blankets would be distributed, a precaution given the unexpected weather, issued without ceremony or comment. Prisoners received them with something approaching gratitude, though pride prevented overt thanks. They folded the new blankets carefully, adding them to their bunks, creating layers of warmth that transformed sleeping arrangements from barely adequate to genuinely comfortable. The excess felt almost decadent, a luxury they had not expected and did not feel they deserved. One guard, younger than most, paused when distributing blankets to notice a prisoner coughing badly, the kind of deep chest cough that suggested illness developing. Without asking permission or making a show of it, the guard draped an extra blanket over the man's shoulders, a gesture so casual it almost went unnoticed. The prisoner froze, unsure how to respond, torn between suspicion and gratitude. The guard had already moved on, continuing his distribution, treating the action as routine rather than significant. This small moment rippled through those who witnessed it, another crack in the edifice of certainty. Guards were supposed to be jailers, enforcers, distant figures of authority. They were not supposed to show concern for prisoner welfare beyond the minimum required by regulations. Yet here was evidence of something else, a casual humanity that confused expectations and demanded reconsideration. Perhaps Americans were not the monsters propaganda had painted, or perhaps individual humans could transcend the roles assigned to them by war. Later that same day, a delivery wagon arrived at the camp, driven by a local civilian under contract to provide various services. Among its cargo were quilts, donated by townspeople and church groups intended for prisoner use. The guards who unloaded them seemed unsurprised, treating this as normal, as expected, though to the prisoners watching from behind wire the sight bordered on surreal. Civilians from the enemy nation, people who had every reason to hate German soldiers, had contributed handmade blankets to keep those same soldiers warm. The quilts bore evidence of their origins, patches of fabric in different patterns and colours, stitching that varied from expert to amateur, edges finished with care that spoke of time invested. One quilt, its border decorated with embroidered flowers clearly done by a child's hand, ended up given to a former panzer officer who had commanded tanks in France. He held it carefully, afraid his rough hands might damage delicate work, and stared at the stitching as though it contained messages he could not quite decipher. That night, conversations in the barracks turned toward attempting to understand this strange behaviour. Some insisted it must be propaganda, a calculated effort to soften prisoners and make them more compliant. Others argued that no propaganda required such effort, that these were genuine gestures from people who somehow separated soldiers from the war itself. A few suggested that Americans simply had so much abundance they could afford generosity even toward enemies, that the quilts represented overflow rather than sacrifice. Major Kraus lay under his multiple blankets, including a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, and found himself unable to sleep despite physical exhaustion. His mind circled around questions without easy answers. What kind of nation provided such care to captured enemy soldiers? What did it say about American character, about their understanding of war and humanity? In Germany, resources went to fighting men and essential production, with little left over for gestures of compassion toward those who had tried to kill you. Yet here such gestures seemed almost casual, unremarkable, as though caring for prisoners represented standard procedure rather than exceptional behaviour. He thought about the citizens who had contributed these quilts, imagined them working in homes scattered across this Texas landscape, stitching and sewing while their own sons and husbands fought overseas, possibly dying in battles against German forces. How did they reconcile that contradiction? How did they square the circle of hating the enemy while providing warmth to enemy prisoners? The questions nagged at assumptions Kraus had carried throughout his military service, ideas about national character and moral superiority that now seemed less certain. By the third night, the worst of the cold had passed, temperatures moderating towards seasonal averages, though still cold enough to require covering. Men settled into routines, adapting to camp life with the flexibility born of necessity. They attended roll calls, performed assigned work details, ate meals provided by American kitchens, existed within structures and schedules imposed by their captors. The blankets became familiar objects, no longer remarkable, simply part of daily existence. Yet their symbolism persisted, impossible to ignore or forget. Every time a prisoner wrapped himself for sleep, he was reminded of his first night, of the mockery and scorn that had preceded revelation, of the moment when pride confronted reality and bent before it. The memory carried weight beyond physical warmth, touched something deeper, challenged beliefs about superiority and destiny that had sustained men through years of propaganda and indoctrination. Some prisoners began writing letters home, permitted correspondence through Red Cross channels, carefully censored but allowed as part of maintaining morale and connection to families. In these letters, many mentioned the blankets, describing them with wonder tinged by confusion. They wrote about unexpected quality, about surviving cold that should have killed them, about American abundance that seemed to operate by different rules than anything they had known. Some mentioned the donated quilts, struggling to explain gestures that defied their understanding of how enemies should behave. The letters would take months to reach Germany, passing through layers of military censorship and disrupted postal systems, arriving in homes where mothers and wives and children waited for any news. When they finally arrived, they would carry messages that complicated official narratives, introduced doubts about simple stories of good versus evil, suggested that perhaps the enemy possessed virtues worth acknowledging. This too was part of the blanket's legacy, ripples spreading outward through time and space, small stones dropped in ponds whose waves travelled farther than anyone intended. As weeks passed and the cold snap became memory, replaced by more typical weather patterns, prisoners settled into the rhythms of captivity. Days filled with work details, language classes taught by guards attempting to facilitate communication, occasional opportunities for recreation. Life became routine, stripped of the intensity that characterized combat, reduced to waiting and endurance. The blankets remained constant companions, used nightly, washed periodically, developing the wear patterns that come with repeated use. Lieutenant Weiss found himself assigned to a work crew maintaining campgrounds, clearing brush and performing basic labor under supervision. The physical activity provided relief from the tedium of confinement, gave him something to focus on beyond his own thoughts. During breaks, he sometimes talked with the American supervisor, a sergeant from Oklahoma who possessed the laconic manner of someone comfortable with silence. Their conversations remained superficial, limited by language barriers and circumstances, but occasional moments of understanding emerged, brief glimpses of shared humanity transcending the gulf of conflict. One afternoon, the sergeant mentioned casually that he had family in Germany, ancestors who had emigrated generations earlier, leaving behind relatives who might still live in villages whose names he had inherited but never visited. The knowledge that he might be guarding distant cousins seemed to amuse rather than trouble him, as though war created absurdities too numerous to catalogue, and one more made little difference. Weiss listened and nodded, uncertain how to respond, aware that history had tangled them together in ways neither could fully comprehend. Private Keller, the young man who had nearly frozen that first night, volunteered for kitchen duty, discovering unexpected talent for cooking despite limited ingredients and basic equipment. The work suited him, gave him purpose and routine, allowed him to contribute something positive to the grim business of survival. American cooks treated him with casual acceptance, teaching him phrases of English while he peeled potatoes and washed dishes, creating small islands of normalcy amid the strangeness of captivity. He thought often about the night he had almost died, about the two men who had shared their warmth and blankets without hesitation, about the realization that survival sometimes depended on cooperation rather than individual strength. The experience had shaken his faith in the militaristic individualism that had been drummed into him during training, the idea that true soldiers stood alone and needed no help. That ideology fell apart when confronted with actual crisis, revealed itself as performance rather than reality. By spring of 1944, as the war in Europe ground toward its inevitable conclusion, though none of the prisoners knew the timeline yet, life in the Texas camp had achieved a kind of equilibrium. Men adapted, found niches, created small routines that gave structure to days otherwise indistinguishable from one another. News filtered in slowly, heavily censored but impossible to suppress entirely, suggesting that German forces were retreating on all fronts, that the Reich's grasp was loosening, that defeat approached with mathematical certainty. The blankets, still used nightly despite warmer weather, had become objects heavy with meaning beyond their physical properties. They represented survival, yes, but also something more complex, a lesson about assumptions and reality, about pride and humility, about the unexpected places where truth might be found. Some prisoners carefully maintained their blankets, folding them precisely each morning, treating them with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or family heirlooms. Major Kraus found himself in conversations with other officers, late-night discussions that circled around questions of what came next, what life might hold after the war ended, and they returned to a Germany that would surely be transformed beyond recognition. They talked about rebuilding, about lessons learned, about the need to move past ideologies that had led their nation to disaster. Someone mentioned the blankets, and laughter rippled through the group. But it was different laughter now, rueful and self-aware, the sound of men acknowledging their own foolishness. One officer, a former professor of history drafted despite his age and poor eyesight, observed that perhaps the blanket represented a larger truth about American civilization. While Germany had built its identity around military tradition and hierarchical structures, around ideas of blood and soil and destiny, America had focused on innovation and production, on solving practical problems through engineering and industrial capacity. Neither approach was inherently superior, he suggested, but in the context of total war, the American method had proven devastatingly effective. His analysis drew thoughtful silence, men considering implications they had avoided confronting. To accept his argument meant acknowledging that German defeat stemmed not from betrayal or insufficient will, but from fundamental miscalculations about the nature of modern conflict. It meant recognizing that all the emphasis on military excellence and ideological purity had missed something essential, that wars between industrial nations would be won in factories and laboratories as much as on battlefields. The conversation continued into early morning hours, ranging across history and philosophy, touching on questions too large for definitive answers. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them, and they dispersed to their bunks, wrapping themselves in American blankets and surrendering to sleep. The discussion would resume another night and another, part of the ongoing process of trying to make sense of catastrophe and find paths forward through ruins. As 1944 gave way to 1945 and Germany's collapse accelerated toward its final conclusion, the camp population fluctuated. New prisoners arrived from various theatres, bringing news from the collapsing fronts, while others were transferred to different facilities as the American military apparatus adjusted to managing hundreds of thousands of captives. Through all these changes, the blankets remained constant, issued to newcomers, collected from those departing, circulating through the system with bureaucratic efficiency. When Germany finally surrendered in May of 1945, the news reached the camp through official announcements and guards who seemed more relieved than triumphant. The war in Europe was over. The killing had stopped. What came next remained uncertain, clouded by questions about repatriation and reconstruction, about trials and accountability, about how to rebuild societies shattered by years of total conflict. For the prisoners, surrender meant both closure and deeper anxiety, the end of one nightmare and the beginning of whatever would follow. Processing for repatriation began slowly, tangled in bureaucracy and logistics, complicated by the need to screen prisoners for war crimes and determine appropriate destinations in a Germany divided into occupation zones. Men waited, sometimes for months, living in limbo between past and future. No longer soldiers, but not yet civilians, sustained by routines and the knowledge that eventually they would go home, or at least to whatever remained of homes they remembered. During this period, American authorities announced that prisoners could keep certain personal items when repatriated, including clothing and basic supplies. The blankets qualified as permitted possessions, and many prisoners chose to keep them, folding them carefully into their small bundles of belongings. The choice surprised some guards, who could not understand why enemy soldiers would want souvenirs of captivity, but the prisoners knew something the guards did not. These blankets carried meaning that transcended their function as mere bedding. Lieutenant Weiss decided early that he would keep his blanket, the same one he had mocked on that first night 3 years earlier. It had developed a small tear along one edge, stained with substances he could no longer identify, the weave slightly fuzzy from countless washings. Yet it remained functional, still capable of providing warmth, still bearing witness to the night it had saved his life and taught him humility. He would carry it home to Germany, however transformed that nation might be, as a reminder of lessons learned in captivity. Hans Keller made similar decisions, though his blanket had been supplemented with patches from one of the donated quilts, fabric sewn on to repair damage. The combination created a hybrid object, American military issue merged with civilian charity, utilitarian and sentimental in equal measure. He imagined showing it to his mother, if she had survived the bombing and chaos that had engulfed German cities, explaining its significance and the circumstances that had granted him survival. The blanket would serve as proof that he had endured, that he returned when so many others had not. The journey home, when it finally came, proved long and complicated. Prisoners were transported to ports, loaded onto ships for the Atlantic crossing, then distributed to various zones based on their origins and the judgments of occupation authorities. Some found their hometowns intact, others discovered nothing but rubble and refugees. All encountered a Germany profoundly changed, humbled and hungry, struggling to comprehend defeat after years of propaganda promising inevitable victory. Through all these transitions, the blankets travelled with their owners, carried in rucksacks and duffel bags, objects of little value to anyone except those who had learned their worth through experience. At customs inspections and checkpoints, officials occasionally examined them, noting their presence on inventories before waving the owners through. No one confiscated them, no one questioned why former soldiers would keep such ordinary items. They were just blankets, after all, cheap and mass-produced, hardly worth the effort of seizure. But to the men who carried them, they represented far more. Sergeant Rice brought his blanket to Bremen, to a city barely recognizable after Allied bombing, finding his family living in the basement of a destroyed building. When his mother asked where he had been and what he had endured, he showed her the blanket, struggling to explain its significance. How could he make her understand that this simple object embodied lessons about American power, about the cost of hubris, about survival granted by enemies who could have let them freeze? She touched the fabric carefully, noting its thin quality, and asked how it could possibly have kept him warm. He tried to explain about synthetic fibres and industrial production, about engineering that prioritized effectiveness over traditional approaches, but the words felt inadequate. Eventually, he simply said that it had worked, that it had saved him, and sometimes that was enough. She folded it carefully and placed it in a trunk where the family stored their few remaining precious possessions, granting it honour alongside heirlooms and photographs. Karl Weiss returned to a small town near the Rhine that had escaped the worst of the destruction, but had lost many of its young men to battles they could not win. His sister met him at the train station, weeping and laughing simultaneously, hardly believing he had survived when so many others had not. At home, his father, aged beyond his years by worry and grief, examined the American blanket with the careful attention of someone evaluating unfamiliar technology. He had worked in textiles before the war, understood materials and construction, could appreciate the engineering even as it challenged his assumptions about German industrial superiority. They spread the blanket on a table, studying its weave under lamplight, discussing fibre types and manufacturing processes, creating a moment of connection through shared interest in craftsmanship. The conversation avoided politics and ideology, focused instead on the concrete and tangible, on what could be measured and understood without wading into poisoned waters of belief and loyalty. In this way, the blanket served as bridge, allowing father and son to reconnect through neutral territory before addressing harder questions about guilt and responsibility. Major Kraus faced different challenges upon return. As a quartermaster officer, he had not been directly involved in combat operations, but association with the regime brought complications during the denazification processes imposed by occupation authorities. Interviews and questionnaires probed his activities and associations, attempting to determine the degree of his complicity in crimes committed by the state he had served. The blanket sat folded on a chair during these interrogations, a witness to his captivity and the humility it had taught. Eventually cleared for civilian life, Kraus found work helping to organize supply distribution for refugees and displaced persons, utilizing skills developed during his military service for different purposes. The ironies did not escape him, managing logistics of survival just as he had during the war, but now focused on rebuilding rather than destruction. His American blanket came with him to the warehouses and distribution centers, a reminder that abundance could serve mercy as well as conquest, that industrial capacity might create life as readily as it had created death. Years passed, and the blankets endured. Some were lost to time and circumstance, discarded when they wore out or left behind during moves. Others remained, tucked into closets and storage spaces, brought out occasionally for use or examination. A few became family stories, objects around which narratives accumulated, legends passed from generation to generation about the night German soldiers learned respect for American engineering while freezing in a Texas camp. Hans Keller lived into old age, working as a cook in restaurants and hotels, never quite escaping the kitchen duties he had discovered during captivity. His children grew up hearing stories about the war, carefully edited to remove the worst horrors, focusing instead on moments of humanity and survival. The blanket quilt hybrid occupied a place of honor in his home, displayed on a wall like artwork, its patches and stains bearing testimony to experiences beyond words. His grandchildren, born into a Germany reunified and prosperous, rebuilt into an economic powerhouse that channeled the discipline and organization that had once served darker purposes toward peaceful production, could barely comprehend the world their grandfather described. Texas prisoner camps and donated quilts seemed like fairy tales, implausible stories from a past too distant to feel real. Yet the blanket remained, proof that the stories were true, that such things had happened, that history was built from small human gestures as much as from grand political movements. When Keller died in the late 1980s, his family donated the blanket to a local historical society, which displayed it alongside other artifacts from the war years. Museum visitors would stop to read the placard explaining its provenance, learning about the Texas camp and the cold front and the lessons taught through fabric. Some visitors touched the glass case gently, as though contact might convey understanding across the years, might bridge the gap between past suffering and present comfort. Lieutenant Weiss never married, never fully recovered from wounds both physical and psychological that the war had inflicted. He worked various jobs, lived quietly, maintained few connections to others. But he kept his blanket, using it nightly, even as it frayed and thinned, patching it repeatedly to extend its life. When he died alone in a small apartment, authorities going through his possessions found the blanket folded at the foot of his bed, its condition suggesting it had been his most treasured possession. They discarded it, not understanding its significance, throwing it out with other items deemed worthless by people who had not lived through what it represented. The blanket ended in a landfill, buried under layers of refuse, its molecules gradually breaking down and returning to elements from which they had been synthesized. In this way, it rejoined the cycle of matter and energy, its physical form lost, but its legacy persisting in memories and stories that continued circulating long after the object itself had vanished. Sergeant Rice maintained his blanket with almost religious devotion, washing it carefully, storing it in protective wrapping, bringing it out on occasions he deemed significant. When his children asked why he cared so much about something so ordinary, he struggled to explain, eventually settling on simple statements that felt inadequate even as he spoke them. "This saved my life," he would say. "This taught me not to judge by appearances. This showed me that enemies could be more merciful than I deserved." The words never quite captured the fullness of what he meant, but they were the best he could manage. Major Krause's blanket outlasted him, passing to his daughter, who had heard its story countless times and understood its importance to her father, even if she could not fully grasp the emotional weight it carried. She kept it carefully, eventually donating it to a military museum that collected artifacts from the Second World War. There it joined displays about prisoner treatment and the German experience of American captivity, providing physical evidence for historians studying those years and those experiences. Researchers examining the blanket analysed its composition, confirming the synthetic fibre construction and marvelling at the engineering that had gone into something designed for mass production during wartime shortages. They wrote papers about American industrial capacity and the logistics of caring for hundreds of thousands of prisoners, using the blanket as a focal point for discussions about what separated the Allies from the Axis in terms of productive capability and resource management. The object had become a teaching tool, a bridge between past and present, a means of making abstract historical forces concrete and comprehensible. But beyond museums and research papers, beyond the physical objects that survived or vanished, the story of the blankets lived in collective memory, passed down through families and communities, told and retold with variations and embellishments, but retaining essential truth. It became a parable about humility, about the dangers of arrogance, about unexpected sources of wisdom and grace. It reminded people that strength takes many forms, that innovation matters more than tradition in certain contexts, that mercy can be extended even to those who might not deserve it. The tale resonated particularly in post-war Germany, as that nation struggled to rebuild both physically and morally, to confront the horrors it had inflicted and the delusions that had enabled them. Stories like this, small human moments amid catastrophe, provided frameworks for thinking about how to move forward, how to acknowledge mistakes without collapsing into despair, how to learn from enemies who had proven wiser than arrogant pride had allowed recognition of during the conflict itself. American veterans occasionally encountered these stories, hearing them from German acquaintances or reading them in memoirs and histories. Most reacted with mild surprise, unaware that something as routine as blanket distribution had carried such significance for those who received them. To the Americans, it had been standard procedure, unremarkable execution of logistics and supply regulations, hardly worth noting amid the larger drama of war and victory. That it had meant so much to the Germans revealed gaps in understanding, different perspectives on the same events, the way significance emerges from context and interpretation rather than existing inherently in objects or actions. The blanket story entered educational curricula in some places, used to teach students about industrial capacity, about psychological dimensions of warfare, about how material culture shapes and reflects values and capabilities. Teachers used it to spark discussions about innovation versus tradition, about judging effectiveness rather than making assumptions based on superficial characteristics, about the complex relationships between enemies who must acknowledge each other's humanity even while seeking each other's destruction. For some students, particularly those generations removed from the war years, the story felt almost mythological, a tale from a distant past when nations fought total wars and prisoners were kept in camps surrounded by wire. They could not quite imagine the world their grandparents and great-grandparents had inhabited, could not fully comprehend the mixture of ideology and practicality, cruelty and mercy that had characterized those years. The blanket became a symbol, simplified and polished, useful for teaching, but perhaps missing some of the messy complexity that characterized actual experience. Yet even simplified, even polished for pedagogical purposes, the core truth remained. German soldiers had mocked American blankets based on preconceptions about weight and quality. A severe cold front had tested those blankets in ways that revealed their unexpected effectiveness. The soldiers had been forced to acknowledge that their assumptions were wrong, that American engineering had solved problems in ways they had not anticipated, that survival sometimes required setting aside pride and accepting gifts from unlikely sources. This sequence of events, however embellished or streamlined in various retellings, contained lessons that transcended their specific historical moment. As decades passed and the Second World War receded into history, The blanket story joined countless other narratives about that conflict, each illuminating particular aspects of the larger whole. Together, they formed a tapestry of memory, attempts to preserve and transmit experiences that shaped the modern world, to ensure that lessons purchased at terrible cost would not be forgotten or ignored. Whether any society actually learns from history remains perpetually questionable, but the effort to remember, to tell stories, to extract meaning from chaos continues generation after generation. The blankets themselves, those physical objects woven in Massachusetts factories and distributed to Texas camps, mostly disappeared into the flow of time. Some survive in museums and private collections, carefully preserved and occasionally displayed. Others degraded and vanished, their materials dispersing back into the environment from which they had been extracted and transformed. But the idea of the blankets, the symbolic weight they carried, persisted and evolved, adapted to new contexts and purposes, used to make points about topics far removed from their original circumstances. In this way, ordinary objects become vessels for meaning, containers for stories that need telling, physical anchors for memories and lessons that might otherwise drift away into forgetfulness. The American blanket that saved German prisoners became more than fibre and weave, more than a functional item designed for a specific purpose. It became memory itself, a reminder that history consists of human beings making choices and facing consequences, learning and failing to learn, surviving through combinations of chance and care and their own efforts to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. And perhaps that is the final lesson, the one that persists when specific details fade and particular stories blend together in the great murky mass of time. Objects matter. Physical things that can be touched and seen carry meanings that abstractions cannot fully capture. A thin blanket, mocked and then treasured, saved lives and changed minds, became a teacher more effective than any propaganda or ideology, demonstrated truths about innovation and mercy that words alone could never quite convey. In the end, it was just a blanket, synthetic fibres woven into useful form, one among millions produced in the vast machinery of American industrial might. Yet it was also more, symbol and reality intertwined. A small thing that carried weight far beyond its physical mass, a reminder that even in war, even between enemies, humanity can persist in unexpected forms and places, offering warmth to those who shiver in the cold darkness of night.